When Emma first suggested we visit her family for dinner, I knew it wasn't just about reconnecting. The tone in her voice, soft but persistent, hinted at something more. "It'll mean a lot to them," she'd said, as though I owed her parents and brother some grand gesture. I didn't argue. Saying no to Emma wasn't something I did easily. And besides, I figured one night couldn't hurt. I should have trusted my instincts. The evening started uneventfully enough. Her parents greeted us warmly at the door, her mother pulling me into one of her perfunctory hugs. "You've lost weight," she said, though I hadn't. Her father shook my hand with that firm grip he probably thought still exuded authority, even though his best years were decades behind him. But then there was Kyle. He lounged on the couch with a beer in hand, barely looking up when we walked in. His t-shirt was wrinkled, his jeans torn, not the fashionable kind of torn either. When he finally noticed us, he plastered on a smirk and said, "Look who finally decided to grace us with his presence. The golden boy himself." I didn't rise to it. Kyle's jabs had always been like this, part joke, part poison. I smiled thinly and handed Emma's mother the wine we'd brought. She accepted it with a glance at the label, her lips twitching as if the bottle wasn't expensive enough. Dinner was served soon after. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, steamed vegetables, the usual spread. The conversation at first was mostly harmless. Her father complained about politics. Her mother lamented the state of their neighborhood. But Kyle, true to form, couldn't resist steering the evening in a different direction. "So, Danny," he began, leaning back in his chair, "what's it like being filthy rich? Do you even know what a grocery store looks like anymore?" The table fell silent. Emma shot him a warning glance, but I kept my composure. "I still shop for groceries, Kyle. I just have to avoid the aisle with overpriced beer. Wouldn't want to step on your territory." Kyle snorted, but I could see the flash of irritation in his eyes. Right. Jokes aside, though, must be nice. Some of us are out here hustling, trying to make ends meet." Emma's mother jumped in before I could respond. "Kyle's been having a rough time with his business lately," she said, her tone heavy with implication. "Oh?" I asked, already suspecting where this was going. Kyle sighed theatrically. "Yeah, things have been tough. The market's brutal right now, and investors are pulling out left and right. I've been thinking of expanding into something more stable, but, takes money to make money." He glanced at Emma, who avoided my gaze. That's when I knew this wasn't an impromptu plea. It was planned. "Have you looked into loans?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Kyle rolled his eyes. "Banks aren't exactly throwing money at small businesses these days. But hey, you're a smart guy. You get it." He paused, then added, "Family's supposed to look out for each other, right?" The words hung in the air, and everyone waited for me to respond. Emma's father suddenly found his fork fascinating, and her mother stared at me expectantly. Emma, to her credit, at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. Cleared my throat. "How much are we talking?" Kyle's face lit up, though he tried to mask it with a somber nod. 50 grand, just to get me back on my feet. Once things pick up, I'll pay you back with interest." It wasn't the amount that shocked me, it was the audacity. $50,000, like it was pocket change, like I owed it to him. I glanced at Emma, hoping for some kind of support, but she looked at me with those pleading eyes I could never say no to. I exhaled slowly. "We'll talk about it later," I said, dodging a direct answer. Kyle grinned as if I'd already written him the check. The rest of dinner was an awkward blur of small talk and forced laughter. I could barely taste the food, my mind racing with what just happened. On the drive home, Emma finally spoke. "I know it's a lot to ask," she said quietly, "but he's family, Daniel, and he's really struggling. It wouldn't hurt us to help, would it?" "It's not about whether it would hurt us," I replied. "It's about whether he deserves it. Did you know he was going to ask me tonight?" She hesitated, and that pause was all the answer I needed. "Emma," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "this isn't the first time Kyle's had money problems, and it's not the first time he's come to us for help. This is different," she insisted. "He's trying to turn things around. He just needs a little push." I didn't argue further. By the time we got home, I was too tired to fight, but the uneasy feeling in my gut refused to settle. Something about the whole night felt calculated, like I'd walked into a trap without realizing it. The next morning, after tossing and turning all night, I made up my mind. Against my better judgment, I agreed to lend Kyle the money. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was Emma's persistence, or maybe I just wanted peace. Whatever the reason, I wired the funds to Kyle that afternoon, telling myself it would be the last time. It wasn't. Weeks passed and I tried to forget about the $50,000. Emma seemed happier, and that was worth something, I told myself. Maybe Kyle would surprise me and use the money wisely. Maybe this really was the push he needed to get back on track. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't until I ran into one of our mutual acquaintances, James, at a networking event that I started to see the truth. James was an old college friend of mine who also knew Kyle through some business circles. "You're a generous guy, Daniel," James said with a grin as we sipped our drinks. I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" James chuckled. "Kyle's been bragging about the vacation he just got back from. Something about Cancun? First-class flights, luxury resorts. He said you made it all possible." My stomach sank. I felt the heat rise in my face, but I forced a neutral expression. "I wasn't aware of any vacation," I said evenly. James tilted his head, catching my tone. "Oh, well, maybe I got it wrong. He mentioned something about a big deal falling through and needing to blow off steam. Anyway, just thought I'd mention it." I nodded, murmuring something polite to steer the conversation away. Inside, I was fuming. $50,000 to save his business, he'd said. But instead, he was sipping cocktails on a beach while I'd convinced myself this was an investment in his future. That night, I brought it up to Emma. She was reading on the couch, the soft glow of a lamp casting warm light across her face. For a moment, I hesitated. But then I thought of Kyle's smug grin, the way he'd looked at me like I was an ATM, and the words came out. "Did you know Kyle went on vacation recently?" She looked up, startled. "Vacation? No, I don't think so. Why?" "James mentioned it earlier. Apparently, Kyle's been bragging about some luxury trip to Cancun." Emma frowned, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I'm sure there's an explanation. Maybe he had the trip planned before you helped him. And maybe he used my money to fund it," I said sharply, unable to hide my frustration. "Emma, I gave him 50 grand because he said his business was failing. If he's lying, don't jump to conclusions," she interrupted, her voice defensive. "Kyle wouldn't do that. Wouldn't he?" I shot back. "You know him as well as I do. He's always looking for an angle, always playing the victim." Her face hardened. "He's not perfect, Daniel, but he's my brother. And maybe if you weren't so focused on the money, you'd see he's trying." I stood there stunned. "Focused on the money? Emma, this isn't about the money. It's about respect. It's about trust. If he's lying to us, you don't know that," she snapped. "And frankly, I'm tired of you acting like you're above my family." Her words hit me like a slap, and for a moment, I couldn't respond. Finally, I nodded, taking a step back. "All right, maybe I'm wrong. I'll talk to Kyle myself and get to the bottom of it." Her expression didn't soften, but she didn't argue further. The next day, I called Kyle. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice casual, almost bored. "What's up, Danny boy?" I wasted no time. "James mentioned you took a trip recently. Cancun, first-class flights, luxury resorts. Sound familiar?" There was a pause, just long enough to confirm my suspicions. Then he laughed. "Oh, that. Yeah, I needed to clear my head after the deal fell apart." "What's the big deal?" "The big deal," I said, my voice cold, "is that you told me you needed $50,000 to save your business. Dramatically. Not to clear Relax, your head. Man. It's not like I blew all the money. Most of it's still going toward the business. The trip was just a little recharge. You wouldn't understand. Guys like you don't have to deal with the kind of stress I'm under." I clenched my jaw, my hand tightening around the phone. "This isn't about stress, Kyle. It's about integrity. You asked me for help and I trusted you. If this is how you handle your problems, maybe I made a mistake." Jesus, Daniel. Get off your high horse, he snapped. You act like 50 grand is gonna bankrupt you. You make that in a week, right? I'm trying to build something here. Maybe instead of judging me, you could try being supportive. His audacity was staggering. For a moment, I was too angry to speak. Finally, I said, "This is the last time, Kyle. You've got the money you asked for. Don't expect another cent from me." "Whatever," he muttered. "Thanks for the pep talk, coach. Real inspiring." I hung up, my blood boiling. That evening, Emma could tell I was still upset. She didn't press me about the conversation with Kyle, but her silence spoke volumes. It was the kind of silence that came with walls being built brick by brick. Over the next few days, the tension between us grew. Emma's parents called, their tone suspiciously chipper. They invited us over for dinner again, but I declined, claiming work obligations. I could feel them pulling Emma into their orbit, subtly positioning me as the outsider. And then the whispers started. Emma's mother called her one afternoon while I was in the other room. Her voice just loud enough for me to catch snippets of the conversation. Daniel's attitude. Always so controlling. Thinks he's better than us. Emma's responses were softer, harder to make out. But she didn't defend me. That hurt more than I cared to admit. It wasn't just her mother either. Word got around in their circle of friends, thanks to Kyle, no doubt, that I was the selfish husband who didn't care about family. I heard it in passing comments at gatherings, in the way people looked at me like I was some kind of villain. The worst part was watching Emma start to believe it. She didn't say it outright, but her body language changed. She pulled away when I tried to hold her. Her smiles felt forced, and her laughter didn't reach her eyes. I tried to brush it off, to tell myself it would blow over. But the nagging feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. Something had shifted, and I didn't know if we could ever get back to the way things were. And then the next request came. Not from Kyle this time, but from Emma's father. A phone call, polite and measured, asking if I could help out with some repairs on their house. The amount wasn't outrageous, just a few thousand, but it was the principle of it. They didn't even try to hide the expectation anymore. I knew then that this wasn't going to stop. Not unless I made it stop. The call from Emma's father hung in the air like a bad smell. He'd been polite, almost overly so, as though softening me up for the blow. His request for help with their house. Just a little repair work, Daniel, nothing major. Felt less like a question and more like a quiet demand. I told him I'd think about it, which was my way of saying no without outright rejection. When I hung up, I felt the now familiar churn of frustration and dread in my gut. This was becoming a pattern. Kyle, Emma's parents, one after the other, they came to me with their outstretched hands, their guilt-laden pleas. Each time I thought it might be the last. Each time I was proven wrong. That evening, I brought it up with Emma as we sat at the dinner table. I could feel the tension building before I even spoke. "Your dad called me today," I began, keeping my tone neutral. She didn't look up from her plate. "Oh, what about?" "They need help with house repairs. He asked me to cover it." Her fork froze midair, then slowly lowered. "And what did you say?" "I said I'd think about it." Emma finally looked at me, her expression already defensive. "Daniel, it's not a big deal. They're not asking for much." "That's not the point," I said, setting my fork down. "Emma, this is becoming a habit. Your family keeps coming to me for money, and they expect me to just say yes. I can't keep doing this." Her eyes narrowed. "They're my family. They're your family too. Isn't that what family does? Help each other." "Helping is one thing," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. "Being taken advantage of is another. Your brother lied to me about needing money for his business, and now your parents are coming to me for repairs they could save up for themselves. When does it end?" Emma pushed her plate aside, her appetite clearly gone. "You make it sound like they're criminals, Daniel. They're not trying to take advantage of you. They're just going through a rough patch." "A rough patch?" I echoed bitterly. "Kyle's been in a rough patch for years, Emma. And your parents? They're retired. They're not struggling. They just know I'm an easy target." Her face flushed with anger. "If you think they're so awful, why did you marry me?" The question hit me like a slap. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay composed. I married you because I love you, but that doesn't mean I have to bankroll your entire family. Emma stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You know what? Forget it. I'll talk to my dad myself. I'll figure it out without your help. She stormed out of the room, leaving me alone at the table. The sound of her footsteps echoed down the hallway, followed by the slam of our bedroom door. I sat there for a long time, staring at the half-eaten meal in front of me. The argument replayed in my head, each word sharper and more bitter than the last. I wanted to believe this was just a rough patch for us too, that we could find our way back to the easy, loving partnership we once had. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how deep the cracks had grown. The next day, Emma was cold but civil, avoiding any mention of her family or our argument. I didn't press her, though the silence between us felt heavier than ever. It wasn't until the weekend that the next blow came. I was going through the mail when I found a letter addressed to me from a local contractor. Confused, I opened it and found an invoice for $5,300. Payment for repairs on Emma's parents' house. My hands tightened around the paper as I read the details. Roofing, plumbing, electrical work. It was all there, neatly itemized and stamped with a cheerful "thank you for your business" at the bottom. I walked straight into the living room, where Emma was sitting with her laptop. She looked up as I entered, her face a mask of calm that only infuriated me more. "What's this?" I asked, holding up the invoice. Her expression faltered for a split second before she recovered. "It's for my parents' repairs. They needed it done quickly, so I took care of it." "With what money?" I demanded. She hesitated. "With ours." I used the joint account. My anger flared, hot and immediate. "Emma, we agreed to talk about these things first. You can't just dip into our savings for something like this without telling me." "They needed help, Daniel," she shot back, her voice rising. "I wasn't going to sit around and wait for you to decide whether they were worth it." "This isn't just about the money," I said, my frustration boiling over. "It's about trust, about respect. You went behind my back because you knew I'd say no. That's not how a partnership works." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her expression remained defiant. "Maybe if you cared about my family as much as you care about your precious money, I wouldn't have to." The words cut deeper than I expected. For a moment I was too stunned to respond. Finally, I shook my head, letting out a bitter laugh. "I'm done, Emma. I'm done playing this game where I'm the villain for not bending over backward for your family. If this keeps up, we're going to have a serious problem." She didn't reply, her jaw tightening as she turned back to her laptop. I waited for a moment, hoping she'd say something, anything, that might diffuse the tension. But she didn't. I walked away, retreating to my home office to cool down. But the anger stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly being pulled between my wife and her family, always expected to give without question. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. I didn't know what the solution was yet, but I knew one thing for sure. Following the invoice incident were some of the loneliest I'd ever experienced in my marriage. Emma and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was cold and clipped. The warmth we used to share felt like a distant memory. Every glance she gave me was laced with resentment, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her piece by piece. I tried to focus on work, hoping that burying myself in projects would distract me from the tension at home. But even there, I found no escape. My thoughts kept drifting back to Emma's family, to Kyle's smug grin, to the mounting pile of demands they kept placing on me. It all came to a head one evening when I got a call from my assistant, Lori. She sounded hesitant, almost embarrassed. "Daniel," she began. "I wasn't sure if I should mention this, but something odd happened today." "What is it?" I asked, already bracing myself for bad news. "Your brother-in-law, Kyle, showed up at the office." I felt a jolt of anger and disbelief. "What? Why?" "He said he needed to speak with you about a business opportunity," Lori explained. "But when I told him you weren't available, he got agitated." He started asking questions about your schedule, your clients. It was strange. My grip tightened on the phone. Did he leave? Eventually, she said. But not before making a bit of a scene. I thought you should know. I thanked her and hung up, my mind racing. Kyle showing up at my office was a line I hadn't expected him to cross. It was bad enough that he treated me like his personal ATM. But now he was encroaching on my professional life. When I got home that night, Emma was in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone. I tossed my keys onto the counter, my frustration bubbling over. Did you know Kyle came to my office today? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She looked up, startled. No. Why would he do that? He said he wanted to talk about a business opportunity, I said, the words dripping with sarcasm. And when my assistant told him I wasn't available, he started causing a scene. Emma's brow furrowed, but instead of looking concerned, she looked defensive. Maybe he just wanted to thank you for helping him. You're always assuming the worst about him, because he keeps proving me right. I shot back. Emma, this isn't normal. Your brother has no boundaries. And I'm starting to think he doesn't even respect me. That's not fair, she said, crossing her arms. You don't know what he's going through. And I'm supposed to be his punching bag because of that? I demanded. Emma, I'm tired of being the bad guy every time I set a boundary. Your family doesn't see me as a person. They see me as a resource, and you let them. Her eyes flashed with anger. Don't you dare blame me for this. I've been stuck in the middle trying to keep the peace, while you sit there acting like a saint. Maybe if you weren't so cold and judgmental, they wouldn't feel the need to go around you. The accusation stung more than I cared to admit. I took a step back, running a hand through my hair. This isn't about me being cold. It's about me being used. And if you can't see that, then maybe we have a bigger problem than your family. Emma didn't respond. She just turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there with a storm of emotions I couldn't untangle. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, trying to figure out where we'd gone wrong. I loved Emma, but the weight of her family's constant interference was crushing me. The next morning, I decided to confront Kyle directly. If Emma wouldn't set boundaries with her family, I would. I called him and told him to meet me at a cafe downtown. He sounded surprised but agreed. When I arrived, he was already there, lounging in a corner booth with his sunglasses perched on his head. Danny boy, he said with a grin as I approached. What's the occasion? I didn't bother with pleasantries. Why did you come to my office? Kyle raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. I wanted to talk to you about an opportunity, something I thought you'd be interested in. Don't insult my intelligence, I said, sliding into the booth across from him. You've already taken 50 grand from me under false pretenses. Now you're showing up at my workplace trying to drag me into whatever scheme you're cooking up. It stops here, Kyle. His grin faltered, replaced by a look of mock offense. Wow, Daniel. Tell me how you really feel. I've had enough, I continued, ignoring his sarcasm. I'm not giving you any more money, and I'm not letting you interfere with my work. If you have any respect for me, or for Emma, you'll back off. Kyle leaned back, his expression hardening. You think you're better than me, don't you? Just because you've got a fancy job and a fat bank account. But let me tell you something, Daniel. Money doesn't make you a good person. And it sure as hell doesn't make you family. I don't need a lecture on family from someone who only shows up when they need something, I said, my voice cold. This is your last warning, Kyle. Stay out of my business. He didn't respond, just stared at me with a mixture of anger and disdain. Finally, he stood, grabbing his jacket. You know what, Daniel? You're right. I don't need you. But don't come crying to me when you realize money can't buy loyalty. With that, he walked out, leaving me alone in the booth. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty seat across from me. Part of me felt relieved that I'd finally stood up to him, but another part of me couldn't shake the sinking feeling that things were about to get worse. When I got home, Emma was waiting for me. Her arms were crossed, and her expression was unreadable. Kyle called me, she said as soon as I walked in. Of course he did. I sighed, setting my keys down. Emma, I had to set boundaries with him. He crossed a line. Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice was firm. You didn't just set boundaries, Daniel. You attacked him. He's my brother. How do you think that makes me feel? I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time, I realized just how deep the divide between us had grown. The tension between Emma and me had reached a breaking point. After the confrontation with Kyle and the fallout that followed, our home became a battlefield of silences and clipped exchanges. It felt like every interaction carried the weight of an unspoken argument. I was exhausted, emotionally drained from trying to hold my ground while also salvaging whatever was left of my marriage. Emma seemed just as tired, though her exhaustion manifested as resentment. The look in her eyes whenever she glanced at me was no longer one of love or even understanding. It was guarded, defensive, as if she was preparing for a fight that hadn't yet started. The tipping point came late one evening when I returned home from work. I'd stayed late to avoid the suffocating atmosphere at home, but the effort felt futile as soon as I stepped through the door. Emma was sitting on the couch, her arms crossed, her face a mask of barely contained anger. "We need to talk," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. I sighed, setting my briefcase down. "All right, what is it now?" She stood, her movements sharp and deliberate. "Kyle told me about your little meeting. So he ran to you," I said, my voice flat. "I'm not surprised." Her jaw tightened. "He's my brother, Daniel. You humiliated him, and you didn't even have the decency to tell me." "I didn't humiliate him," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I set boundaries, something he desperately needs." "To you, it's just setting boundaries," she snapped. "But to him, it's a slap in the face. He's family, Daniel. You don't treat family like that." "And how does family treat me, Emma?" I shot back, the frustration boiling over. "By lying to me, using me, and then turning around and complaining that I'm not doing enough? That's not family, that's manipulation." Her eyes flashed with anger. "Maybe if you showed them some respect, they wouldn't feel the need to go around you." "Respect," I repeated, incredulous. "Emma, your brother has done nothing to earn my respect. He's taken money from me under false pretenses, shown up at my office uninvited, and tried to guilt-trip me into giving him more. And instead of calling him out, you defend him," she shouted, her voice breaking. "Because he's my brother, and I can't just turn my back on him." Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I'm not asking you to turn your back on him," I said, my voice quieter now. "I'm asking you to stand with me, to put us first for once." She looked at me, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by that same hardened expression. "I can't do that," she said quietly. "Not if it means abandoning my family." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, trying to process what she just said. "So what does that mean for us?" She didn't answer, her silence speaking volumes. I turned and walked out of the room, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. I felt like I was losing everything. My wife, my marriage, the life we'd built together. And for what? To protect myself from being used? To stand up for my own dignity? That night, I slept in the guest room. The bed was cold and unfamiliar, and the loneliness felt suffocating. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the conversation in my head, trying to figure out where we'd gone wrong. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. It was a text from Lori. "Call me when you get a chance," it read. Something urgent came up. I got up, still groggy, and called her back. She picked up on the second ring. "Daniel," she said, her voice tense. "I didn't want to bother you at home, but I thought you should know. There's been some activity on your accounts." I frowned, suddenly wide awake. "What kind of activity?" "Large withdrawals," she said. "Multiple transactions over the past week, all to the same account. It doesn't match any of your usual spending patterns." My stomach dropped. "How much are we talking about?" Close to 30,000, she said. I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. That's impossible. I haven't authorized anything like that. That's what I thought, Lori said. You should check with your bank. Could be fraud. I thanked her and hung up, my mind racing. I logged into my online banking, my hands shaking as I scrolled through the transactions. Sure enough, there it was. A series of transfers, each for several $1,000s, all to an account I didn't recognize. I sat there, staring at the screen, my heart pounding. The numbers blurred together, but one thing was clear. Someone had been stealing from me. The realization hit me like a freight train. There was only one person who had access to our joint account, Emma. I confronted her as soon as she woke up, holding my laptop in one hand and the phone in the other. She looked at me, her expression groggy and confused. What's going on? She asked, rubbing her eyes. You tell me, I said, my voice cold. Why are there $30,000 missing from our account? Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of guilt. But then she straightened, her expression hardening. I transferred it to my parents, she said, her tone defiant. They needed it more than we do. I stared at her, barely able to process what she just said. You what? They're struggling, Daniel, she said, her voice rising. And you refused to help them. So I did what I had to do. You had no right, I said, my voice shaking with anger. That money was ours. You had no right to take it without asking me. They're my family, she said, as if that justified everything. And what about me? I demanded. What about our family? Or does that not matter to you anymore? Her silence was deafening. I took a step back, the weight of her betrayal crushing me. I can't do this anymore, Emma, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I can't keep fighting for something that clearly doesn't matter to you. She didn't respond. Her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and regret. I turned and walked out, the sound of the door closing behind me echoing in my ears. For the first time, I felt like I was truly alone. I spent the night in a hotel, staring out of the window at the city lights and trying to make sense of what my life had become. The betrayal cut deep. Emma's actions weren't just about money. They were about trust, or the lack of it. I'd married her believing we were a team, but now it felt like we were on opposite sides of a battlefield. The next morning, I called the bank to freeze our accounts. It felt like an extreme measure, but after what had happened, I couldn't afford to take any chances. The representative on the other end was polite but curious, and I gave them the bare minimum explanation. Unauthorized transfers. Once that was taken care of, I headed into work, hoping the routine would give me some clarity. Instead, Lori met me at the door, her expression anxious. Daniel, there's something else, she said. I wasn't sure whether to bring it up, but I think you need to know. I sighed, already bracing for more bad news. What is it? She handed me a folder, her hands trembling slightly. This came in yesterday, a request for a large invoice on your behalf, but it doesn't look legitimate. I opened the folder and scanned the document. It was an invoice for a significant sum, supposedly for a consulting service I'd never provided. My name and company details were on it, but the signature was forged. My chest tightened. Who sent this? Lori hesitated, then said, It was Kyle. Of course it was Kyle. I felt the anger rising again, hot and uncontrollable. This wasn't just about taking advantage of family ties. This was outright fraud. I clenched the folder in my hands, forcing myself to breathe. Thanks for letting me know, I said. I'll take care of it. Lori nodded and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat in my office for what felt like hours, staring at the invoice. The nerve of Kyle, to not only exploit our personal relationship but now to drag my professional reputation into his schemes. This wasn't just a line crossed, it was a full-blown attack. By the time I left work, I'd made up my mind. I was done letting Kyle and Emma's family walk all over me. I wasn't just going to set boundaries anymore. I was going to enforce them. When I got home, Emma was sitting in the living room, scrolling through her phone. She didn't look up when I walked in, and the silence between us was suffocating. I froze the accounts, I said, breaking the quiet. That got her attention. She looked up, her eyes narrowing. You what? I froze our accounts, I repeated. Until we can sort this out. I'm not taking any more risks. Her expression darkened. So this is how it's going to be? You're just going to cut me off. I didn't cut you off, I said, my voice calm but firm. I'm protecting what's left of our finances after what you did. What I did was help my family, she snapped. And what your brother did was try to scam me at work. I fired back, tossing the invoice onto the coffee table. Did you know about this? She picked up the paper, her eyes scanning the text. Her face went pale, and for a moment, I thought I saw genuine shock. No, she said softly. I didn't know about this. Then maybe it's time you open your eyes, I said, my voice rising. Your family isn't just asking for help anymore, Emma. They're taking, lying, and now they're dragging me into their schemes. She put the paper down, her hands trembling. I didn't ask him to do this, Daniel. I swear. I believe you, I said. But that doesn't change the fact that this has to stop. I'm going to the police. Her head snapped up. The police? Daniel, you can't. He's my brother. And he's a criminal, I said, the words sharper than I intended. Emma, if I don't do something about this, it won't just be my reputation on the line. It'll be my career, my company, everything I've worked for. Tears filled her eyes, but I didn't back down. After Emma locked herself in the bedroom, I made the call. The police were surprisingly understanding, though they warned me it might be a long process. Filing a report was the first step, they said. Gathering evidence would take time. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and uncomfortable conversations. I had to explain the situation to my business partners, assuring them that the fraudulent invoice was being handled. Most of them were sympathetic, but the experience left me feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way I wasn't used to. At home, things were even worse. Emma barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was with thinly veiled anger. I knew she blamed me for involving the authorities, but I also knew I didn't have a choice. One evening, after another day of tense silences, Emma finally broke down. I don't know what to do anymore, she said, tears streaming down her face. This is tearing us apart. I sat down beside her, feeling a pang of guilt despite everything. Emma, I don't want to fight with you, but I also can't keep living like this. Your family, they're not just hurting me, they're hurting us. She nodded, wiping her eyes. I know. I don't know how to say no to them. Then let me help you, I said gently. We need to set boundaries, real ones, and we need to stick to them together. She didn't respond, but the look in her eyes told me she was finally starting to understand. It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but it was a step in the right direction. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The fallout from involving the police was swift and messy. News of Kyle's attempted fraud didn't take long to spread through Emma's family. By the end of the week, I'd fielded more phone calls than I could count, each one angrier than the last. Emma's parents accused me of overreacting. Her cousins chimed in with lectures about family loyalty. And even a distant aunt, whom I'd never spoken to, decided to weigh in with a scathing voicemail. At first, I tried to explain myself, but the more I listened, the clearer it became that no one wanted to hear my side. To them, I wasn't a husband trying to protect his livelihood. I was the villain who'd betrayed their trust. Eventually, I stopped answering altogether, letting the calls go straight to voicemail. It wasn't worth the stress. Emma, on the other hand, couldn't escape the storm. Every time I came home, I found her on the phone, tears streaming down her face as she tried to defend me, or at least mitigate the damage. But even when she wasn't speaking, I could feel the weight of her resentment. She wouldn't say it outright, but I knew she blamed me for the rift tearing through her family. One evening, about a week after the initial fallout, Emma finally confronted me. I'd just finished dinner, alone as had become our norm, when she walked into the kitchen, her face pale and drawn. "We need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I set my fork down, bracing myself. All right. She sat across from me, fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. For a moment, she didn't say anything, and I wondered if she was trying to find the right words, or if she was hoping I'd break the silence first. I can't keep doing this, she said finally. Her voice was trembling, but her eyes were steady. The fighting, the distance. It's too much. I know, I said, keeping my tone gentle. It's been hard on both of us. She nodded, taking a deep breath. I've been thinking a lot about everything. About Kyle, about my parents, about us. And I think we need some space. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Space, I repeated. Yes, she said, her voice cracking. Just for a little while. I need time to figure things out. And I think you do too. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. Are you asking for a separation? She hesitated, then nodded. I think it's for the best. At least for now. My first instinct was to argue, to tell her that running away from our problems wouldn't solve anything. But as I looked at her, I realized how exhausted she looked. How exhausted we both were. Maybe she was right. Maybe some distance would give us the clarity we so desperately needed. Okay, I said quietly, if that's what you think is best. She looked surprised, as if she'd expected me to put up more of a fight. Thank you, she said, her voice barely audible. We spent the next few days making arrangements. Emma decided to stay with her parents for a while, which felt like a betrayal in itself, but I didn't say anything. I knew better than to start another argument. The house felt unbearably quiet after she left. At first, I tried to distract myself with work, throwing myself into projects and meetings. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the silence always crept back in, reminding me of what I'd lost. A week after Emma moved out, I got an unexpected visit from Kyle. He showed up unannounced, standing on my doorstep with an expression that was equal parts defiant and desperate. We need to talk, he said as soon as I opened the door. I didn't want to let him in. Every instinct told me to shut the door in his face and be done with him for good. But something about the look in his eyes stopped me. Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and motioned for him to come in. Kyle sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He looked nervous, almost like a child waiting to be scolded. It was such a stark contrast to his usual bravado that I couldn't help but feel a pang of curiosity. What do you want, Kyle? I asked, keeping my voice calm but firm. He hesitated, then said, I know I screwed up, with the money, with the invoice. All of it. I messed up, and I'm sorry. The words caught me off guard. I'd expected excuses, deflections, maybe even a half-hearted attempt to shift the blame. But genuine remorse? That was new. I appreciate the apology, I said carefully. But sorry doesn't fix what you did. You put my career at risk, Kyle. My reputation. I know, he said quickly. And I'm not here to make excuses. I want to make things right. I raised an eyebrow. How? He took a deep breath, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is everything I took from you. Every dollar. I've been talking to a lawyer, and they're helping me set up a repayment plan. It's going to take time, but I swear I'll pay back every cent. I took the paper, scanning the numbers. It was detailed, meticulous, even with a clear breakdown of how he planned to repay the money. For the first time, it seemed like Kyle was actually taking responsibility for his actions. This is a start, I said, folding the paper and setting it on the coffee table. But it's not enough. If you really want to make things right, you need to stop relying on other people to bail you out. That means getting a job, sticking to it, and proving that you can stand on your own. He nodded, his jaw set with determination. I will. I promise. For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Kyle could change. But I also knew better than to get my hopes up too high. Action spoke louder than words, and Kyle had a lot to prove. After he left, I sat in the empty living room, staring at the folded piece of paper on the table. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was finally starting to take back control of my life. The weeks that followed were tense, but slowly, things began to settle into a new normal. I continued to work, focusing on my business and trying to stay out of the whirlwind of drama that seemed to constantly surround Emma's family. Despite her move out, Emma and I had been in contact, but the conversations were strained, heavy with unspoken words. We still hadn't fully addressed what had happened between us. I wasn't sure if she was ready to confront the full extent of her betrayal, or if she was just too tired to fight anymore. I understood her confusion, though. After everything, we both needed time to rebuild ourselves. But I wasn't sure what the foundation of us, even slowly, painfully slowly, he started repaying the money he'd taken, though I wasn't sure how long he would be able to maintain his resolve. Every month he sent a check, small, sometimes late, but at least he was trying. Couldn't let my guard down, though. Trust was a fragile thing, and he'd shattered it with a single selfish act. But I had to admit, part of me wanted to believe that there could be some redemption for him, for us. It wasn't just Kyle, though. Emma's parents, despite their condemnation of me, seemed to take his side. I knew they were upset, but the fact that they couldn't see the larger picture, how much I had sacrificed to help them, how much I had done for this family, was beyond me. It was clear that they were wrapped up in the idea of family loyalty at all costs, even if it meant ignoring right and wrong. I couldn't change their minds. I couldn't make them understand. I had to let that go. And the hardest part of all was letting Emma go, even temporarily. But the truth hit me one night, as I sat alone in my apartment, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring at a silent phone. I realized that it wasn't just about the betrayal. It wasn't just about Emma's inability to see the harm in her family's actions. It was about how I had let myself become a doormat, constantly giving, constantly being used, without standing up for myself. I had been an ATM to her family, and Emma had let me be. She never questioned their demands, never stepped in when they pushed too hard. And now I was paying the price for that lack of boundaries. I had allowed myself to be trapped in a cycle of giving in, until there was nothing left to give. That night, I made a decision. It wasn't just about cutting ties with Kyle, or even with Emma's family. It was about cutting ties with the version of myself that had been so afraid of disappointing them, that I'd allowed myself to be taken advantage of. It was time to reclaim my life, to stand up for the person I had become. And if Emma couldn't understand that, if she couldn't support me in that decision, then maybe we weren't meant to be together. The next day I called Emma. I had to hear her voice, to see if she was ready to face the truth of what had happened between us. She answered quickly, her voice soft, almost too soft. "Daniel, I was thinking about you last night, about everything." I held my breath, unsure of what was coming. "What about us, Emma? Are you ready to talk?" There was a long pause. "I don't know if I can ever be the person you need me to be," she finally said, her voice trembling. "I've been thinking a lot about my family, about everything that's happened, and I think you're right. I've been blind to a lot of things." Her words were a relief, in some ways, but there was something in her tone that unsettled me. She sounded almost resigned. "What do you mean?" "I don't know if I can change, Daniel," she admitted. "I don't know if I can stop taking care of them, if I can stop putting them first. You're right, I've been letting you fight these battles alone, and it's not fair. But I don't know if I can be the person you want me to be anymore. I don't know if I can put myself first." The weight of her words settled in my chest like a stone. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even disappointed. I was just exhausted. Emma was stuck in her own web of guilt and duty, and no matter how much I wanted her to be the partner I needed, she couldn't escape it. I knew I couldn't wait around for her to change. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to find the right words. "Emma, I've been trying to be the person you need me to be too. But we can't keep pretending everything is okay when it's not. I can't keep fighting for us alone. I need someone who will stand by me, not someone who will always put their family's needs before mine. I need someone who sees me, who values me." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low and hesitant. "I don't know if I can do that, Daniel." "I know," I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "And that's okay. I can't make you change, and you can't make me forget what's happened. I think it's time we both accepted that. I could hear her breathing shakily, and I couldn't tell if she was crying or just holding it together. I wasn't sure how I felt either, relieved, sad, angry all at once, but it didn't matter. The truth was there, hanging in the air between us. And in that moment, I realized that it wasn't about her or her family anymore. It was about me reclaiming myself, my own sense of self-worth. I think we need to take a break, Emma said softly. I think we need to figure out who we are without each other. I took a long breath. I agree. The conversation ended quietly, and I sat in silence for a long time, my mind racing. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if Emma and I would ever find our way back to each other. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I was finally making the decisions I needed to make for myself, even if it meant stepping away from the people I had once been willing to sacrifice everything for. The hardest part was still ahead of me, though. Saying goodbye wasn't easy, but I knew it was the right thing to do. It wasn't just for me, it was for her too. We both needed to heal, and we couldn't do that while still tangled in each other's lives. As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange sense of calm. The next chapter was uncertain, but it was mine to write. The days after my conversation with Emma were the hardest I'd ever faced. There was no dramatic closure, no grand moment of release, just a quiet, lingering ache that gnawed at me, reminding me of all the things I had lost. But I had made the decision, and now it was time to live with it. Emma and I were no longer tethered to each other in the way we had been before. We were free, but freedom felt heavy. I stayed busy with work, focusing on my business and rebuilding the momentum I had lost during the chaos of the last few months. I poured myself into every project, every task, trying to distract myself from the ache of loneliness that kept creeping up on me. My phone stayed silent for days, and when I did get a message, it was usually from one of Emma's family members, asking about how I was holding up or subtly blaming me for everything. I'd stopped replying, unsure if there was any point left. One day, about a month after Emma and I had separated, I walked into my office to find an envelope on my desk. It was simple, plain white paper with no return address. The moment I saw it, a sense of dread washed over me. My heart sank as I carefully opened it, pulling out a single sheet of paper. As I read the words on the page, my hands trembled. It was from Emma. The letter was brief, but the words hit me with the force of a freight train. She apologized. She admitted that she had been wrong, that she had taken her family's side for too long and had neglected what was important, what we had. And then, at the end of the letter, she made a simple request. "Can we meet?" I sat there, staring at the letter for what felt like hours, the words blurring as my mind raced. After everything, was I ready to see her again? To reopen that door? The same door I had just shut with so much effort and pain? Part of me wanted to burn the letter, to dismiss it and tell myself that it was too little, too late. But another part, maybe the part still holding on to the hope I thought I had left behind, wondered if we could fix this, if we could truly rebuild, if we could both change. It didn't take long for me to decide. I picked up the phone and texted her. "I'll meet you tomorrow. Same place." Her response came quickly, "Yes, please." I found myself standing outside the small coffee shop we had always visited, waiting. The morning air was crisp, the kind of quiet, peaceful morning that made everything feel surreal. I didn't know what would happen or what would be said, but I knew I couldn't avoid this any longer. I couldn't hide from the possibility of reconciliation. I had to face it head on. When she walked in, I almost didn't recognize her. She looked different. Her eyes had a tiredness in them that hadn't been there before. Her shoulders were hunched as if the weight of the world was on them. She was wearing the same jacket she used to wear when we first met, and it felt like a ghost of the past had walked through the door. She caught sight of me and froze for a moment before walking over, her steps slow and deliberate. She sat down across from me, and we both just stared at each other, neither one of us saying anything at first. The silence between us was thick with unresolved tension. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The apology was raw, vulnerable. and it stung in ways I didn't expect. Because as much as I had wanted her to say those words, to admit that she had been wrong, now that she had, it didn't feel like the relief I had imagined. It felt like the final piece of a puzzle that had been incomplete for so long. And now that it was in place, I didn't know what the picture looked like anymore. "I know you are," I replied softly. I had to be careful with my words. This was delicate, fragile. I didn't want to say something I would regret. "I don't know where to start," she continued, her eyes meeting mine with a quiet desperation. "I was so wrapped up in my family, in their needs, that I didn't see how much I was hurting you. I didn't realize how much I was taking from you until everything fell apart." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my emotions. It wasn't easy. I couldn't keep giving, Emma. I couldn't keep sacrificing myself for everyone else. I needed you to stand by me, but you didn't. You chose them. Her eyes welled up with tears. I didn't know how to choose. I didn't know how to stop being the daughter they expected me to be. I didn't know how to be the partner you needed. I failed you. The tears in her eyes hit me harder than I expected. I had wanted her to feel the weight of what had happened. But now that it was here, it felt like too much. "I can't just forget everything," I said, my voice rough. "I can't pretend like nothing happened." "I don't expect you to," she said quickly. "I don't want you to. I know I hurt you, and I can't undo that. But I can do better. I can be better. If you'll let me." For a moment I said nothing. The pain, the frustration, all of it came rushing back. I wanted to yell, to tell her how much she had let me down, how much I had been betrayed. But somehow I couldn't. I was too tired, too drained. I didn't want to keep reliving the past. Instead, I took a deep breath and looked at her. "I don't know if we can fix this, Emma. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. But I'm willing to try. If you're willing to try too." She nodded, a shaky breath escaping her lips. "I'll do whatever it takes." We both sat there in silence, the weight of the conversation sinking in. There was no easy solution, no magical fix. What had happened between us was irreparable, but maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to rebuild, to start from somewhere new. It wouldn't be easy. It would take time and effort and a lot of pain. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. Not a promise of perfection, but the possibility of something real, something worth fighting for. As we left the coffee shop, neither of us had the answers, but we had taken the first step, and that, in itself, was enough to start a new chapter. Whether it was the right one or not, I didn't know, but it was mine. Our future was ours to create.